Hulk Hogan was a man who lived his entire life in front of the world. Yet in the final hours of his life, everything went quiet. When news broke that the wrestling icon had been found unresponsive in his Florida home, many believed the story would end there. Authorities spoke of a natural passing, tributes poured in, and fans mourned a legend. But behind the official statements, something else was unfolding inside Hogan's mansion. And what investigators began to uncover in the days that followed would leave even seasoned professionals deeply unsettled. The morning Hulkamania ended. On the morning of July 24, 2025, Clearwater, Florida woke to devastating news. Hulk Hogan, born Terry Jean Bollea, had been found unresponsive inside his mansion at the age of 71. Police and fire rescue were dispatched after a report of cardiac arrest at the property. Emergency crews attempted life-saving measures before transporting him to Morton Plant Hospital, where he was pronounced dead later that morning. Within hours, headlines around the world began to circulate, framing the loss as tragic but expected for a man who had endured decades of physical punishment inside the ring. At first glance, the explanation seemed straightforward. Hogan had a documented history of serious medical issues, including atrial fibrillation, a condition that causes irregular heart rhythms, and chronic lymphocytic leukemia, a form of blood cancer. Just 2 months earlier, in May, he had undergone major neck surgery, one of more than 25 operations he had endured over the past decade. Medical authorities would later confirm his official cause of death as acute myocardial infarction, commonly known as a heart attack. His manner of death was ruled natural. But even as the public accepted those facts, the situation inside Hogan's home told a more complicated story. According to those familiar with the scene, Hogan's wife, Sky Daly, returned home earlier than expected from a wellness retreat. She had no reason to believe anything was wrong. Hogan had been maintaining a disciplined routine in recent years, focused on recovery, fitness, meditation, and a quieter life away from the spotlight. By all outward appearances, he had found a sense of stability that had eluded him for much of his career. When Sky entered the house, she called out to her husband and received no response. The silence felt wrong. As she moved deeper into the home, toward the area where Hogan spent much of his time training, she discovered him lying motionless near a weight bench. There were no visible signs of a struggle. Nothing appeared overturned or broken. Yet something about the scene immediately felt off to her. Paramedics were called. CPR was attempted. But Hogan never regained consciousness. As word of his death spread, local authorities began what was expected to be a routine investigation. There were no immediate signs of foul play, no forced entry, and no evidence of violence. But as officers documented the interior of the mansion, certain details stood out. Details that did not align with what they knew about Hogan's habits, his routines, or the condition he was reportedly in just days earlier. The gym that didn't make sense. When investigators began documenting the interior of Hulk Hogan's mansion, one room immediately stood apart from the rest. It wasn't the bedroom, it wasn't the living space, it was the home gym. For decades, Hogan's gym had been more than a workout room. It was his sanctuary. Friends, trainers, and family members all described it the same way: active, lived in, constantly in use. Towels were usually draped over benches. Dumbbells were rarely perfectly aligned. Protein shakers, resistance bands, old championship belts, and motivational banners filled the space. This was where Hogan trained through injuries, surgeries, and setbacks. It was where he held on to the identity that made him who he was. But on the morning of July 24th, that room told a very different story. According to sources familiar with the initial assessment, the gym appeared unusually clean. Not tidy, not organized, sterile. Every weight was racked evenly. Mats were spotless. Mirrors were wiped clean. There were no sweat-soaked towels, no half-used water bottles, no signs of recent exertion. Even the air lacked the usual smell of rubber, metal, and physical strain that typically clung to a room used daily by a professional athlete. To trained eyes, this wasn't the aftermath of a workout. It looked more like a space that had been carefully reset. This detail alone might not have meant much, but it directly contradicted what Sky Daly and Nick Hogan had both told investigators. Hulk Hogan had been training consistently. He followed a strict routine, especially after his neck surgery in May. He wasn't reckless, he didn't overtrain, and he certainly didn't abandon his gym habits without reason. Even more puzzling was where Hogan was found. He was discovered near a weight bench, yet there were no signs that a workout had taken place shortly before his collapse. No displaced equipment, no evidence of strain or struggle. For a man known to push his body hard, the scene felt strangely disconnected from the lifestyle he lived. As investigators continued their walkthrough, the inconsistencies began to stack up. The rest of the house showed normal signs of daily living. Nothing else appeared staged or unusually clean. Only the gym stood out as frozen in time. That raised an uncomfortable question. If Hogan had not been actively training in that space shortly before his death, why was he there? And if he had been training, why did the room show no trace of it? The security system that was silenced. After documenting the gym, investigators turned their attention to something far less visible, but far more consequential: the mansion's security system. What they found there quietly shifted the entire tone of the inquiry. Hulk Hogan was deeply private. Despite decades in the spotlight, he was known to be meticulous about personal security. His Clearwater mansion was equipped with a top-tier system that included high-definition surveillance cameras, motion detectors, remote access controls, internal backups, and layered redundancy designed to prevent tampering. This wasn't casual home protection. It was a system built to leave a digital trail. When technicians reviewed the system, they discovered that the security network had been manually disabled from inside the house. There was no evidence of a power outage, no signs of external hacking, no system error logs. The shutdown had been deliberate, controlled, and executed with knowledge of how the system worked. Even more troubling, there were no alarms triggered and no recorded alerts in the hours surrounding Hogan's death. The cameras had not captured footage of unusual movement. The motion sensors showed no irregular activity. For a home that should have documented every significant entry, exit, and internal movement, the data was strangely silent. Investigators were careful with their conclusions. A disabled system does not automatically mean foul play, but context matters. Hulk Hogan was not someone who casually turned off his security, especially given his health condition and recent surgery. Those close to him described him as cautious, not careless. The idea that he would intentionally shut down his entire system without explanation raised immediate questions. There was also no evidence of forced entry. Doors and windows were intact. Locks showed no signs of tampering. That narrowed the possibilities. Either Hogan disabled the system himself for reasons unknown, or someone with access and familiarity with the house was present. At this point, federal specialists were consulted to assist with digital forensics. Smart home logs were retrieved. Cloud backups were examined. Encrypted data associated with the system was pulled and analyzed. Investigators mapped activity patterns from the previous 72 hours, searching for anything that could explain the blackout. What they didn't find was just as important as what they did. There was no sign of an external breach, no digital fingerprints suggesting a remote intrusion, no anomalies pointing to a cyber attack. The silence wasn't the result of interference. It was the result of intentional control. The phone call that changed everything. 3 days before Hulk Hogan was found unresponsive in his home, something happened that would later become impossible to ignore. It wasn't a public appearance. It wasn't a medical emergency. It was a phone call. According to Sky Daly, the call came late in the evening. Hogan answered it without hesitation. What followed was unlike anything she had witnessed during their relationship. He stood still, listening in silence for nearly a full minute. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react outwardly. When the call ended, he said only one word, then hung up. Skye later told investigators that the moment unsettled her deeply. Hogan looked pale. His posture changed. The man who had survived decades of physical punishment, media scandals, and personal collapse suddenly seemed shaken in a way she had never seen. She described it as fear, not panic, not anger, fear. He didn't explain who had called or what had been said. He didn't want to talk about it. But from that night forward, Skye noticed a shift. Hogan became quieter, more withdrawn, still polite, still affectionate, but distant, as if something had been switched off internally. Investigators later confirmed that the call was real. Phone records showed an incoming connection routed through a complex web of foreign servers. The number was unlisted. The signal bounced across multiple jurisdictions, making it nearly impossible to trace. Even advanced forensic tools struggled to identify the origin. The contents of the call were never recovered and remain classified. What made the call significant wasn't just its mystery, it was its timing. In the weeks leading up to it, Hogan's life appeared stable. After years of chaos, he had settled into a structured routine. He trained carefully, not recklessly. He meditated daily. He ate clean. He focused on recovery after his May surgery. Those closest to him described this period as one of the calmest he had experienced in decades. Nick Hogan later echoed that sentiment. He said his father was in better shape than most men half his age. He followed his routine with precision. He wasn't impulsive. He wasn't spiraling. He wasn't acting like a man in crisis. And in the past that wouldn't stay buried. When investigators widen the lens of an inquiry, they don't start with theories. They start with patterns. Because a person's final days rarely exist in isolation. And in Hulk Hogan's case, the past was anything but simple. For decades, Hogan's life unfolded publicly. In the early years, he built the image of an indestructible hero. In private, that image came at a cost. His first marriage to Linda Claridge began in the early 1980s, long before fame reached its peak. Together, they raised 2 children, Brooke and Nick, and for a time, they appeared to embody the ideal American wrestling family. That image became part of popular culture when their reality series brought cameras directly into their home. But behind the scenes, the pressure was relentless. Fame amplified every argument. Rumors multiplied. Trust eroded. When allegations surfaced involving a woman connected to Brooke's music career, the family dynamic fractured publicly and permanently. Hogan denied wrongdoing, but the damage had already been done. Linda filed for divorce, ending a marriage that had lasted more than 2 decades. The separation was not quiet. It was financially devastating and emotionally brutal. Hogan later admitted he fell into a deep depression during that period. He spoke openly about contemplating suicide, a moment when the persona of Hulkamania collapsed under the weight of real life. He survived, but investigators note that survival doesn't erase scars. It adds them to a timeline. Hogan remarried years later, hoping for stability, but that relationship also ended without delivering lasting peace. By the time Skye Daly entered his life, he was older, physically worn, and openly seeking something different. Skye wasn't just a partner. She represented calm, routine, control. Their marriage marked a shift away from chaos, not toward it. Still, the past didn't disappear. Hogan's relationship with his daughter Brooke remained strained. She was notably absent from his wedding. While no public hostility defined their distance, the separation was real. Investigators don't treat estrangement as motive. They treat it as context, because unresolved family dynamics often resurface during moments of crisis. Financial pressures, too, had shaped Hogan's later years. Though still wealthy, His fortune had fluctuated dramatically over time due to lawsuits, divorces, and medical expenses. None of this pointed to wrongdoing, but it reinforced a central truth. Hogan's life had been built on cycles of rise, collapse, and recovery. The body, the surgery, and the official truth. As investigators moved toward closing the inquiry, the focus inevitably returned to Hulk Hogan's body. Not the legend, not the rumors, the body that had carried decades of physical punishment. 2 months before his death in May, Hogan underwent a major 4-level anterior cervical discectomy and fusion surgery. The procedure was serious, especially for a man in his 70s, but not unexpected. Years of wrestling had left his spine severely compromised. Those close to him said he approached recovery with discipline, not denial. He followed medical advice. He trained carefully. He avoided reckless strain. Still, medical experts acknowledge that such procedures carry long-term risks that may not appear immediately. Combined with Hogan's history of atrial fibrillation, a condition that disrupts normal heart rhythm, and chronic lymphocytic leukemia, his cardiovascular system was already under stress. To the public, Hogan still looked powerful. Internally, his body was fighting multiple battles at once. When the medical examiner's office in Pinellas County reviewed the case, the conclusion was clear. Hulk Hogan's official cause of death was acute myocardial infarction, a heart attack. His manner of death was ruled natural. No autopsy was performed. His death was certified by his primary care physician. Police stated there were no signs of suspicious activity. For some, that explanation was enough. For others, it wasn't. Brooke Hogan initially pressed for more clarity, requesting answers and transparency. After reviewing official evidence, including medical findings and body camera footage, she later stated that she accepted the conclusion. What haunted her most wasn't unanswered questions, but the 911 call itself. Hearing Sky's voice that morning, she said, was more traumatizing than seeing her father's body. Meanwhile, speculation continued outside official channels. Talk radio hosts, online commentators, and anonymous sources fueled theories that authorities never confirmed. Claims of hidden rooms, encrypted files, or deeper conspiracies circulated widely. Federal agencies declined to comment. No evidence supporting foul play was made public. At the same time, legal tensions quietly emerged. Sky Daily reportedly explored the possibility of a medical malpractice claim related to Hogan's surgery. Nick Hogan moved to protect his father's legacy against what he described as reckless allegations. These actions weren't about rewriting the cause of death. They were about control, about dignity, about closing a chapter without distortion. In the end, the investigation reached its limit not because answers were hidden, but because the evidence led back to the same place. A heart that had endured extreme physical stress for decades finally failed. So now the question is this: do you believe the official explanation tells the whole story, or do some details still leave you uneasy? Let us know what you think in the comments, and if you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for the next video.